Kennedy School. I had the privilege to be his student in 2003. I attended all his classes and I was so impressed. And I thought before we do anything further in our EGROW webinar series every Friday, I have to request him to come and speak to us. And while he not only teaches at the Kennedy School, he has been a regular scholar, visiting professor at International Monetary Fund and at the World Bank. So the privilege of listening to him was so immense. I wanted to get him to come and speak to the Indian academic team. So that's where we are. We requested him and he was kind to immediately agree and said he is going to join us. So he is right now heading the growth lab at the Kennedy School. He has been the minister in the Venezuelan government of planning. He is the former head of the Presidential Office of Coordination and Planning in Venezuela and a scholar. In his writings and in his research, he brings real life stories and makes the research very interesting. One of his most interesting research that I had seen was the theory of how economic development happens. And he had the tree and the monkey theory. Today he is not presenting that, but one of these days I'm going to request him to present that also, because that just opens up the mind to how economic research takes place. In his research, he has used some fantastic concepts to make economics so interesting. You must have heard about the regional sin, and Professor Ricardo had brought it in the economic theory. He thinks about dark matter and brings it into the economic theory. The product space and terms like this and economic complexities. So with this, Professor Ricardo is very well known. I don't need to go deeper than that. I'm going to request him to make his presentation. For the session today, we have Dr. Arvind Virmani, Chairman of EGROW, chairing the session. We have requested Professor Ricardo to make a 35 minutes to 40 minutes presentation, and then we are going to have the question answer session. Over to Dr. Virmani to chair the session, please.
Thank you, Charan. I just want to add one thing, what I have liked about Professor Hausman is probably one of two or at most three economists who worked on development economics on developing countries. And what always struck me was his kind of innovative thinking, raising new ideas, trying to put a theory on it, etc. So that is what I recall, and I always enjoyed reading his thing. So when Charan suggested that he could call him, I really encouraged him to do so. So Professor Hausman, please, we look forward to your presentation.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm honored. It's really for me a pleasure to be able to be with you. I was last in India about 2 years ago. I visited Hyderabad and Kerala. I went for the first time right after I taught Quran in 2003. I went to for the first time to India in 2003 to Mumbai and Delhi, and I visited Rajasthan. And since then, I've been several times, I would say about 8 or 10 times to India in different places. So I miss it. I really like it. I'm fascinated by India. The only thing for this presentation is that I'm going to try to say something about India, but the only thing I can say about India comes from downloading data sets. And I know how dangerous it is to talk about a country when the only thing you have seen is data sets. So everything I say, I want you to take with a ton of salt, not a grain of salt. And I'm perfectly willing for you to tell me that I'm completely wrong. But at least so don't be offended, and don't be at worst I just made a fool of myself. So let me just say what I'm going to say, and then you tell me what you think. So I'm going to talk about COVID because it's very hard to talk about economic growth and about other things and longer term things until we get the control of this COVID problem. And so I'm trying to think systematically about this COVID problem and think what to do. So I've been talking to about 10 governments since March on what their strategy is, how can they cope with this. So I downloaded the data for India. On the x-axis, I have two axes here. This red line is the decline in mobility according to Google. Okay, and the blue line is deaths, daily deaths per million, averaged over 7 days. So what you find here is that, like in many countries, there was an initial lockdown. Many countries adopted the lockdown in March. You adopted it mostly in April. And that lockdown was associated with very little contagion. Then the lockdown was partly reversed, not fully reversed, but then you got a peak. The peak was fairly short, as we will see, and then you brought it back down. So it's a pattern that is not unlike that of many other countries. So that you have a very tough lockdown with no disease and a lot of disease with less lockdown. Okay, and this lockdown. This peak came down by 75% or so within 4 months. So that's more or less how, the numbers. If I compare India to the other BRICS, say I'm going to compare India to Brazil and to South Africa, you see that the peak in India is very small. So compared to the other countries that I've been talking to, it's very small. It also came in later. Brazil had the peak much earlier. And you see that when they adopt lockdowns or wherever, they get a plateau. It takes forever for it to come down. And now they're in a second peak. In South Africa, they had a peak, they brought it down, but they now have a huge peak. So in most countries I'm working on, they are either in their second or in their third peak. And India is in the first peak. I mean, we wish it was the last peak. Okay, but I don't know to what extent India is somewhat delayed, but that my question is, should we think of India as having had its peak or having had its first peak? Okay. So that's my first observation. My second observation is that if we think of the spread of the disease worldwide, I'm going to take some pictures and I'm going to stop, for example, the picture. I'm going to take the picture of the world on April 26, and I'm showing you cumulative deaths per million. And on the x-axis, I have GDP per capita at PPP. So on April 26, COVID was a rich country problem. It was in Belgium, Spain, Italy, Great Britain, France, Netherlands, Sweden, Ireland, Switzerland, and the US. And there's nothing in low-income countries, nothing in middle-income countries except in Iran, etc. So that's on April 26. When I take the picture in late September, the disease had moved to middle-income countries. So on top of Belgium, you get Peru, and then below Peru, you get all the Spanish speakers: Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, etc. Right? Together with Spain and Great Britain and so on. So it became a rich and middle-income country. Very, very little contagion in poor countries. And when I take the picture on January 24th of this year, it has grown more in middle-income countries. So now you have a bunch of Eastern European countries like Bosnia, Macedonia, Georgia, etc., etc. but still very little in poor countries. Okay, very little in poor countries. So you see India down there. So the question is that, is in 6 months' time, will the virus have moved to low-income countries? We look at this even within sub-Saharan Africa. I'm working on Ethiopia and I'm working on South Africa. In South Africa, as I showed you before, they're in the middle of a huge peak, the biggest peak right now, when they thought they didn't plan for this. They thought that 2021 was a year of recovery. They thought that they had controlled their previous peak. But Ethiopia has had no peaks. So the lower the income of the country, it seems the easier it has been to delay the onset of the contagion. And this is where the hotspots are right now. So you see, for example, they're in Portugal, Great Britain, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Slovenia, but they're in Swaziland, South Africa, and so on. And they are starting to appear here in Malawi, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Comoros, and so on. So you're starting to see it spread now to lower income countries. And there's India, it's still a very little effect. So the way, epidemiologists think about the disease, they think of it in these terms. I'm going to present super simply this model just to try to extract some implications of how we should think about the timing or the tempo or the process of this disease. So these SIR model starts, with a susceptible population. Since the disease is new, say everybody was susceptible. Then the disease starts spreading and you get infected people. And then after they get infected, they recover, and presumably they recover and have immunity. So they cannot no longer get infected and transmit the disease. That's at least the hope. And there's this R factor that we've all heard about, which is the number of susceptibles that each infected person infects on average, right? So when you put this in a model, it gives you these shapes. The susceptible population starts here at 100%. Then the red line is that some people start getting infected. Those that get infected, fortunately, the great majority of them recover. And as they recover, they are no longer susceptible in theory. So this thing peaks, and I'll tell you something about the peak, and then it dries out after essentially everybody has developed immunity, or there's enough immunity in the system that the virus cannot survive, because the virus can only survive in living people, and if they don't find hosts in which to replicate, the virus disappears. So these graphs are made with a constant R factor. Without social distancing, the R factor was assumed to be between 3 and 4. These new variants, the British variant, the South African variant, the Brazilian variant, apparently are more contagious. So in principle, that R factor would be higher in these new variants. Now, this peak occurs when the susceptible pool is 1 over R. So if you take R to be 3, the peak occurs. So this becomes flat when every infected person infects 3 other people, but 2/3 of those people are already immune. So only 1/3 remains susceptible. So 1/3 times 3 is 1. So you just keep constant the number of infections, and that's why it's flat at the top. So the peak occurs, the peak of the infection occurs when 1 over R is the susceptible populations. That means that 1 minus 1 over R, 2/3 in this case, would still be, would have to have developed immunity, okay? If the R factor is 4, then it would be 3/4, 75% would have to have developed immunity. That's only for the peak. At the end of the disease, this is the fraction that needs to be immune for the disease to disappear at the end of the infection. That is here at the end, how many people would have been infected. And you see, with an R factor of 3 or 4, you get that over 90% of the people need to be infected. Okay, so that's what would happen in the absence of a vaccine. That's how this would disappear. Now, if we look at the world and try to estimate the levels of immunity in the system, one way to do it is to ask, what's the percentage of the population that has had confirmed cases? And as you see, everywhere in the world, that number is less than 10%. Okay, so maybe this number is undercounted, maybe it's 20%, but we're nowhere near the 70% or 80% that you would need for this stuff to be over. So we're very, very far from herd immunity. And in the absence of a scenario of a vaccine, we are very early on in the process, especially in low-income countries. Okay, so the bet of the world is not that we're going to wait for everybody to get sick, but that we're going to wait for everybody to get vaccinated. Okay, because otherwise, we're very, there's a lot of game to be played still. Okay, now these SIR models, as they're called, they have been, they come from the 1920s. There's been a lot of work on how to make them better. One of the ideas is that the R factor is not a constant. It depends on behavior. It's not a constant where everybody infects the same average number of people. There might be some people who are super connected to other people. They meet many people on a daily basis and consequently can be super spreader people. And there are others who see fewer people. So typically in rural areas, population densities are much smaller. People live at a bigger distance from each other. So it's much easier for them to distance. So the disease has trouble getting into rural areas. But once they get there, they spread. So within rural areas, households tend to be bigger. So there's more within household transmission and so on. And the other thing is that these transmission things are not constant over time. In the north of the US, it tends to spread more easily in wintertime because people are indoors. In the south of the US, it tends to spread more easily in the summertime because it's so hot that people are indoors. So poor countries may have a lower R than rich countries because there's less dense human networks, less dense human interactions. It's not a coincidence that it spread very quickly in Manhattan because Manhattan is super dense, right? So that may be the reason why Ethiopia has so many fewer infections than South Africa, no? That it's just because the different levels of development implies different levels of human interaction and consequently the ability of the disease to spread. Okay. Now, so in practice, these curves don't look like a single peak thing. They look like up and down. And take a look at Switzerland. They had this peak here, they brought it down, and then they had this humongous other peak that they're barely able to bring it down now. So obviously it means that the R factor is responding to social distances and so on. So in India, the epidemiological shock has not been very large. And, I'm putting in parentheses yet, because as, Zhou Enlai in China said, when asked about what did he think about the French Revolution, he said, it's too early to tell. We're in the middle of the pandemic. We should not make big statements about, which countries have successfully controlled the disease, because this is a moving game. I've been working on Jordan, and Jordan had a spectacular control of the disease, and then they got a humongous peak in November. By November, they thought, they had controlled everything, and 2021 was going to be a period of recovery and so on. But right now they're in the middle of a peak, and they are shut down, and they're in their second lockdown. So that's on the epidemiological side. On the economic side, we have to ask ourselves the question: what kind of economic shock is COVID? On the one hand, it represents a supply shock because you're telling people that they cannot go to work. It's a disruption to a bunch of industries. The education industry is disrupted. Restaurants and bars are disrupted. entertainment and sports are disrupted. So those are industries that they may have plenty of demand, but they cannot supply because they're restricted. And then there is this international transmission of the economic shock. If that means that, you know, if commodity prices are affected, tourism is affected, remittances are affected. So some countries, for example, Belize or Aruba and some there, they were fantastic at controlling the disease, but they're tourist destinations and tourism disappeared, so they are in a catastrophic economic situation, even though the epidemic is not there. Okay, and then there's issues of, you know, do you get a sudden stop? Do you maintain access to international finance and so on? So this is a measure of the supply shock, if you want. This is the cumulative fall in mobility and the cumulative increase in time spent at home. Okay, so here is the decline in going to work, and this is the increase in staying at home. These are the toughest lockdowns. They're all Spanish speakers except for the Philippines, Panama, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Chile, Colombia. So it's my people. And then it's India. So you had a very, very tough lockdown relative to other parts in the world in both dimensions. And we see a correlation between how much did mobility decline and how much did GDP decline. So I did this graph with the World Economic Outlook data that they issued in October. I understand that they issued a new report just now. I saw this morning, and where I think the fall in GDP is a little bit smaller for India, like 8%. But in any case, we see this negative relationship that the tougher the lockdown, the bigger the fall in GDP. Okay, on external shocks, initially we thought that they were going to be very big. There was a huge decline in oil prices. There was decline in all other metal prices, but they recovered since, and they're now above pre-crisis levels. There's a huge decline in remittances at the beginning of the period. They recovered nicely in my part of the world. My impression is that remittances from the Gulf are down. So those did not recover. So countries like Ethiopia suffered more from reductions in remittances. And this is the decline in travel, in the number of flights, and those were dramatically curtailed. So anybody that depended on tourism, business travel, and so on have been significantly hurt. Emerging markets typically are quite volatile, but what we saw is a big spike in yields followed by a normalization. Not always to initial levels, but essentially, you know, capital markets have been open mostly for emerging markets. So these add up to very different sizes of external shocks to different countries. Some were very much hit by commodity prices, disruptions to trade, and so on. But my impression is that the external shocks appear to have been a small part of the story in India. So they're not as significant as they are in other countries that are smaller and more open than India. There might have been, you know, trade shocks within India, but I haven't studied them. So then we can look at you know, how does this crisis compare to other crises? So I'm going to develop this mechanism to measure a crisis. I'm going to look at the data. Whenever I see a decline in GDP, I'm going to start a clock, and I'm going to leave the clock running until GDP goes back to its initial level. When that happens, I'm going to stop the clock and I'm going to measure the duration of the crisis. Second, I'm going to measure the peak to trough. I'm going to take the pre-crisis peak and I'm going to calculate the minimum before the crisis is over, and I'm going to call that the depth of the crisis, or peak to trough. And then I'm going to calculate this area under the curve, that it's the GDP lost during the crisis, okay? So for example, for the global financial crisis, you know, even though it was supposed to be a financial crisis, as its name indicates, and you would expect that it would hurt first financial centers like Switzerland or the United Kingdom. So this is the duration of the crisis. It lasted 1 year in Belgium and Switzerland. Peak to trough, they lost 2% of GDP, and the total area under the curve was 2% of GDP. Okay, at the opposite extreme, you have countries like Greece and Latvia. Latvia finally recovered. Greece has yet to recover fully. Peak to trough, Greece lost 26% of GDP, Latvia 21%, and the area under the curve is 100% or 200% of 1 year's GDP. For the US, it was barely 3% of 1 year's GDP, but it was 10 times that in Cyprus. It was 4 times that in Denmark and Netherlands and so on. So those are numbers, peak to trough, 2-3%, 4%, 5%. Only in very few countries do you get these humongous declines. The Latin American debt crisis, you see a peak to trough 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, except for very few countries that had double-digit declines in GDP. So that's the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s is a traumatic experience. I finished my PhD in 1981. The crisis happened in 1982. So it's transformed my personal career, this crisis. So I remember it vividly. So this is the shock to output according to the World Economic Outlook. It says that it projected in October a decline in GDP of 10%. I think they've pared that down a little bit now for 2020, and they assume a sort of like a super quick recovery, so that by 2021, supposedly you are back to pre-crisis levels. Okay. By the way, this is what they thought was going to be the growth rate the previous year. So this gap, I'm going to also compare this gap, what they thought was going to happen in 2020 and what actually happened in 2020, and I'm going to measure it across countries. But in this basic scenario, 2021 is a year of recovery, and we're going back. But when you project this, the previous trend of income and the current trend of income, there's a gap. So there's like a permanent shock to income. So how does this shock compare? So this is the new revised version. So this is GDP goes from 104 to 96 or so. This is the 8% decline. And then by 2021, you're above 2019 levels. That's the January projection of the IMF. In my experience, they made projections in April that were very, very optimistic. They made projections in October. In the countries that I'm working on, I think they'll be very, very optimistic. I think that we're going to see something different, unfortunately. So this is the COVID crisis. That's the 10% decline in India. It's not the biggest in the world. These are all tourist destinations. This is Aruba, Belize, Bahamas, etc. But you also have some of my people, Peru, Argentina, and so on, with very, very large crises. You have the crisis, the recession in India being particularly big. Here I put the worst crisis that these countries have ever had before COVID, and here I put COVID. This is a 45-degree line. So countries above the 45-degree line, this is their worst crisis. So this being the worst crisis for Ecuador, France, Mexico, Belgium, etc. This is post-1960. My data starts in 1960. So for India, it's the worst crisis post-1960. The previous one was in 1979, according to this calculation. So now I'm going to calculate not the decline in GDP, but the correction to 2020 GDP that the IMF did between 2019 and 2020. And here, interestingly, India is about the worst in the world. Okay, so it has a correction in its GDP projection of over 15%. And that puts it in line with Peru, Iraq, and others that had huge revisions, but these countries were not expected to grow as much as India. So so what we find is that, from this point of view, the deceleration caused by COVID in India is world class. It's one of the worst. So in conclusion of this part of the presentation, what I want to say is that the epidemiological shock in India has been small in terms of infections and deaths, but until now, it makes me wonder, how should we think of 2021? Should we think of 2021 as a year in which you will still need to restrict activity because you are fearing a peak, because you are in a peak, and so on? So I'm leaving that open. The IMF projection presumes that the problem is over. But even though the epidemiological shock has been small, say by the standards of Brazil or South Africa and so on, the correction to growth has been huge, okay? Even though the country suffered a relatively small external shock. So it's a humongous shock to output with a small shock to a small epidemiological shock. So that's a little bit of the puzzle. So now let's look at the fiscal response to the puzzle. So this is what the IMF projected. They projected a serious decline in revenues that was going to recover gradually, a big increase in expenditures relative to where they thought the expenditures were going to be in the previous wheel, and as a consequence, a big widening of the fiscal deficit. Big widening of the fiscal deficit. How does this compare internationally? Well, the decline in revenues is sort of like not impressive by international standards. The increase in spending, rich countries tended to increase spending more than poor countries. And for its level of income, India increased more than proportional, if you want. So the deficit widened more than would have been expected. I mean, the deficit widened by over 10 percentage points of GDP in all of these rich countries. It widened by something like 5% to 6 percentage points of GDP in India. And it represents a fairly significant part. I mean, it's one of the larger widenings of the fiscal deficit. Unfortunately, the IMF does not include India in the projections of debt to GDP ratio. But you see that the rich countries did much more on the fiscal side than poor countries. So in sum, the epidemiological shock has been small, the growth slowdown has been huge, in spite of small external shocks, and there's been fairly massive fiscal support. Okay, so you cannot say that the economic shock has been large because the fiscal has not been present. No, the fiscal has been present at least more than expected. Okay, given the country's level of income, and probably if we would have corrected for epidemiological considerations. So this suggests that the crisis was dominated by the supply shock. It was not the demand side, but the supply side of the economy that suffered. So these are some of the policy questions I would want to put on the table. The first one is, can we increase the effectiveness of social distancing? That's a big question, because you seem to have paid a huge cost for the lockdown relative to the infections that you were able to address or reduce. So that's the first question. How can you increase the effectiveness of social distancing where you get less infections at a lower GDP cost? A second question is, will the government remain solvent? A third question is, will banks remain solvent? Fourth question is, will firms remain solvent? So here I have some policy ideas that I want to throw out. The first one is that countries need to focus on maximizing fiscal space. And you maximize fiscal space by anchoring in expectations about the solvency of the government. So you don't want to do a fiscal adjustment in the middle of a crisis, but you want to signal a fiscal adjustment so that markets remain supportive in the middle of a crisis. And I think that what's coming worldwide, and I'm trying to help countries see how to implement that idea, is I think that we're going to move in a world where there's more taxation of capital income. Many countries, I think we've gone through a 4-decade reduction in taxation of capital income. I think that will be reversed. The reason why people wanted to tax capital income, wanted not to tax capital income, is because the more you tax it, the more it moves away from you. So in order to attract capital to your country, you would lower taxation on capital income. But I think that the world is moving now to a period of more tax cooperation, or at least tax information cooperation on taxes, so that you tell the capital owners, if you put the money in my country, I tax it. If you take the money out of the country, I'll still tax you, because I'll tax you on your global income. And I will know your global income because you will put that money in another country that will share that information with me. That's at least the agenda of the OECD. They're proud of saying that through their initiative, they've shared information on 5 million bank accounts, which held $5 trillion in assets. And this is just like the information sharing across tax authorities. So if there's more ability to tax global capital income, there's more ability to raise tax rates on capital income at home. Okay, so that's one thing. A second thing is that we are connecting through digital means. So the digital divide becomes that much more important in the context of COVID. And if COVID is not going to go away anytime soon, it will take several years for India to vaccinate all of its population. In the meantime, people work remotely. But according to the World Bank statistics, India has less than 40% internet, high bandwidth penetration. So, this is a big digital divide, and countries are wondering what can they do to expand access. And so some countries, middle-income countries, are thinking of subsidizing the fixed cost of connecting, and maybe subsidizing the first year of operation or something. It becomes that much more expensive for low-income countries, but it's an issue. Other ideas is that many companies are going under. We starting to have now micro data on the value-added tax in different countries, and we are finding out that more small enterprises declined, disappeared. The decline in output of small enterprises was bigger than bigger enterprises, and so on average. And that means that the companies that are going to survive are going to have lost a lot of their equity. Okay, and if the recovery starts, banks are going to see them as being over-indebted, as being having too little of their own capital and too much debt relative to the equity they have. Governments have tried to solve this problem by offering guarantees, and some with more success than others. But this transfers all the risk to the fiscal accounts, and that will always have to be limited, because how much debt can the government guarantee is especially governments that are not fully credible in terms of their fiscal solvency. So I think we need to find a more market solution. In the advanced countries, say like in the US, there's been massive new issuance, and they've even invented something, or capitalize on something that was previously invented, something that they call special purpose acquisition companies. So these are companies that go out and sell shares saying, give me the money and I will find companies that are good companies with very little equity, and I will buy them up in the cheap and I'll recapitalize them. So there's a mechanism for market recapitalization, and they can buy small companies, they can buy medium companies, they don't have to buy big companies, because what trades is the special purpose vehicle, not the underlying companies that they bought with that money. So that's an innovation that allows to connect small and medium enterprises to the capital market, something that has typically not been the case before. So I take this as an example because I think we need to be thinking hard about how to address the coming equity shortage or the present equity shortage in a lot of the companies, and find market solutions. And in many places, the investors that buy equities are institutional investors, and they're highly regulated, pension funds, insurance companies, and so on. So maybe we need to think of the regulation in light of the new equity instruments that we would like them to buy, but they probably cannot buy them on current legislation. Another idea is that one of the consequences of this crisis is that we know that many things that could be done in the office can now be done from home. So there's much more telework. In the US, out of 144 million jobs, 53 million are teleworkable. Of those 53 million jobs, right, anything that can be done from home can be done from abroad. I notice in the Growth Lab, because people say, if I can't go to my office in Cambridge, why do I have to be in the US? So I have now my staff of about 50, they're all over the place, from Spain to England to the Netherlands to Austria to Chile to Colombia. They're all over the place, and we work fine. Now here, this is an area where I think India has a comparative advantage. India has been the leader of trade in tasks with business process outsourcing and so on. I think that's going to be a permanent trend that's going to increase. And I think that, I think it's going to change. There's going to be many, many more things that will be done through telework. And so we need to think of what are the markets, the mechanisms, the ways in which people were going to be able to arbitrage these wage differentials that underpin the world today. So those are the ideas I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much. And I'm now open to the interesting part of the story. At least thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We are at 7:30, but let me start by just making a few points before I open up for questions. Sure. Just a little bit of information. We've done a lot of work in EGROW Foundation. Started very early on COVID, and at that time, of course, data was very limited. But there's a nice. We did some thinking on the theory. So that's a paper if you're planning to continue to do work on the spread of the disease, you might find of some use. And then after that, we also, of course, that's not current, so it doesn't give. But in the current space, I would add that the economic survey, the chapter 1, which has just come out today, it does a lot of analysis of COVID along the lines you've done to place both India in an international context and look at the differential among Indian states on the propagation, etc. Especially the state one you might find useful because it gives a different perspective from the global one. On the economics of it again, and here, Charan, perhaps one or two of those papers you can send to him. We did very early complete analysis of the supply and demand effects and how these would evolve over time as the economy recovered, etc., etc. So probably the two papers, the first one with Karan and the second one on fiscal and monetary policy, perhaps you can send, where as far as I can see, at least for India, we have been completely on track. And the interesting thing is the actual experiment is of the theoretical stuff we outlined, the government has more or less followed what we had kind of suggested. I don't know whether they read the paper or they just got on the same track. So that also may be useful if you ever get back to studying India, whether, how that has worked out. Having said that, I find two of your ideas very interesting, which we really not considered. Of course, we have analyzed the Indian situation and given policies specific to it, for example, some tax reforms, etc., which are there on those papers. But this idea I find very intriguing about SPAC. I've been following SPACs as far as they are in the US, but I think your use of that idea to see somehow if that could help SMEs in developing countries, I think it's a very intriguing one. And the second one, the data is useful. Again, we have been focusing on this digital, especially in the social areas, etc. India, and there's been a lot of public interest in fintech and the basic digital architecture, etc. But this number I find very useful. Again, this you said 53 out of 144 million jobs. That's quite a lot. A very interesting number I found. Anyway, there are a number of other interesting points which from your talk, but let me throw it open because we are running out of time. So if we can ask people to, if they have specific questions, or Charan, do you want to start it off and then we can ask the others?
Yeah, sure. Professor, would you have 15 more minutes to spare? I know it's early morning and you have to start your day. Sure. Okay. So I have a question and I'm going to request others to just either put it in the chat or raise their hand in the chat place so we know who wants to ask a question. Professor, I found your presentation really very interesting. And the fact that you mentioned, this had not occurred to me, that now people will like to work remotely, and if they can work from home, they can pretty well work from their own country. And it means a lot. And to me, it also means that sitting in India, it also means that if we have to work from home, it'll be almost like, and that's the new culture that's going to develop, it's almost like augmenting an additional room in my house or going in and boosting more investment into the housing sector. So I look at it as a great opportunity, and knowing that the housing has backward forward linkages so large, I think we need to really think about the policies now and therefore make sure that a country like ours is now connected by optic fiber as quickly as possible so that we can give the best. As you mentioned, I was at Harvard. If you remember our luncheon discussions about the BPO and the jobs which came into India at that time, and NASCOM, when I had spoken to them long time back, 2003. I think that's the trend which is emerging with the young demographics of India, high skilled, better English speaking capabilities. I think this is a very interesting presentation that you have made. Thank you for that. That was just an observation I want to make. And now let's open the house for questions.
Any questions? I don't see anything on the chat yet. So perhaps, Professor, if you just want to respond to that while we wait for the questions.
Yeah.
One more observation I would like to make for the professor. You are mute probably.
Yes. India is the most successful exporter of business services. You have the largest multinationals in the world. You have Wipro, you have Tata Consulting Services, and so on. Those were business models that would leverage this Indian capacity and sell it abroad and so on. I think you have a comparative advantage. You're the first mover there. I think that's just going to be a humongous growth area. It's going to move into new things. I now have people in my office that are taking violin lessons with a professor in China. So I think that the amount of trade that is going to move online is probably going to be very significant. But the companies that can arbitrage, that here, having your Indian diaspora, connecting things. So I think that's a very interesting and important area. But I think Dr. Anand is online with his hands raised, and I'm eager to hear.
Yes. Okay. Right. Anand Saab, you want to ask your question?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Am I clearly audible, sir?
Yes.
Right, fine. So thanks, Dr. Virmani and our respected Charan Singh sir, for giving us this opportunity to be connected with the global experts like Dr. Ricardo Hoffman today. Sir, I was going through your research and really was getting benefited because you took it so intensive and deeply from the start till the pandemic now, and unfolding little bit about the future also. So my thanks for that. So I have a question that I was wondering that what directional changes do you foresee in the composition of GDP post pandemic, especially in context of emerging economies?
I want to supplement this question of Mr. Anand with another question which I was, thinking right now, Professor, that you are sitting in the growth lab, and as I look at it from the theory that you have built and the hypothesis that you have, the transportation sector is going to suffer or going to shrink, according to me. If the new culture of working from home and remotely, and if with the help of optic fibers you're going to work from your own cities and villages, then transportation sector is one sector which is going to suffer the most. That reminds me of the experiment in early 1930s when most of the cities in America had their own local public transport in terms of trams, and General Motors then developed the engine, and those trams and city public transport was dismantled, and the single vehicles, the cars, took over. That was a revolution in terms of transport, and this probably would be the second time when there's going to be reversal to that. Your views on it?
Very good. So the first thing I want to say is, before we think of the post-COVID world, we need to get through COVID. I think that there's a lot of runway, if you want, still, before we get to post-COVID. And I'm wondering what are going to be the consequences of COVID. In my part of the world, I see very significant damages to the balance sheets of the government. I see very significant damages to the balance sheet of banks. I see very significant damages to the balance sheet of firms. And this may cause dislocations and so on that may disrupt the growth in many places. That's a little bit what happened with the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. It was followed by a decade of no growth, a decade of negative per capita income growth. Not because there was anything stop to technological progress in the world, but because something broke in the system. So my first concern is that is to preserve macro stability, financial stability, and so on, political stability, because so one question I have is, have we seen the last peak in India, or should we think of 2021 as a year in which you might have two more peaks? and then how do you think of growth in that context? So that's just to a word of alert of saying, you know, we are not yet in the post-COVID world, and when we get there, we may get there with some liabilities that we're currently not seeing. So that's my first word of caution. Then the question on the composition of output, I think that there is a big puzzle in the world in asking ourselves what requires human contact and what does not require human contact. So what are the activities that require human contact? Obviously, you cannot cut somebody's hair from home. You cannot till the field from home, right? So there's a lot of tasks that involve physical presence. And there's some tasks that if you're allowed, if you want to do with other people, you know, watch football games or whatever other things, right? I just published a paper with my colleagues Frank Nefke and Michele Kosha in Nature in the summer on business travel. And what we found is that business travel today predicts productivity increases, export increases, employment increases 3 years down the road. So apparently business travel has been very important historically in the global movement of know-how, in the global movement of technology. And the fact that we've shut down business travel means, you know, that a lot of interactions haven't happened, a lot of ideas haven't circulated. You know, there is a reason why, you know, in firms like McKinsey are moving people around and brains around, because as they say, it's easier, it's very hard to move know-how from brain to brain. It takes, you know, Malcolm Gladwell says it takes 14,000 hours to become good at something, or 10,000 hours to become good at something. At 40 hours a week, that's 13 years. So it takes a long time to put know-how into brains. It takes very little time to move brains. So the mobility of brains has been very important for technological diffusion. And we're wondering to what, so that's been the history up to now. The paper was published in August. So what are the consequences of reductions in human interaction is something that I want to leave open. But yes, I think that the scope for doing things from home is going to definitely increase. That means less office space. That means a very important transformation in real estate. You are thinking of expanding places at home, but you're also shrinking places in the office. So the net of that is something we need to think about. I think commute times may become more flexible. India has had, you know, enormous problems with traffic and congestion and so on. So maybe in that growth path, it's going to make it a little bit less of a humongous headache, but I think still relative to where you want to be, you'll still have to expand your transport infrastructure enormously going forward. You're also urbanizing massively in the next decade or so. So I'm assuming that still transport is probably going to be an important, you know, a dynamic sector in the economy. Let me stop there.
Yeah, so I see two questions, but they are both about the future. So given the shortage of time, I don't know. But let me ask you a COVID question. You know, from whatever the science which has come from COVID so far, what we know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the most serious spread occurs in closed spaces, you know, where air is circulated, or you know, and much less in open spaces, you know, and well ventilated spaces. But I have not heard much about, you know, incentives for, or people pushing, say, incentives for better filtration in, say, cinemas, malls, transport hubs, etc., or some. I had heard about 6 months ago about a new UV filtration technology, which could be fixed on the roofs of smaller rooms, and so on. Have you, can you tell us anything about this, which you have learned or?
Yeah, well, I want to first, filtration issues are top of mind in the US because in the fiscal package that President Biden is putting together to reopen schools, they're a line item there. These filtration systems are a line item, and they are considered. In my part of the world, we've seen some of the worst contagion in very, very hot cities like Guayaquil in Ecuador, Manaus in Brazil, etc., where indoors, etc., is less of an issue. People there think that part of the problem is that households are big. So the bigger the household, the more intra-household transmission there is. And households in India are large. And they think that many households don't have refrigeration. Because they don't have refrigeration, they go shopping more frequently. They get infected when they shop, etc. So I think it's very, very, very important that we learn more about how people are getting infected, because it says a lot about their social demographic structure and dimensions that we did not know were relevant vis-a-vis this phenomenon.
Yes, that's interesting. Okay, let me just read out the two questions. I don't know whether you want to take it up. One is by Vigneshwara Swami, Dr. Swami. In post-COVID scenario, how do you look at the emergence of new economy and its contribution to global economy? Another one is from Luis Kumar Tater. Will the upcoming growth be a jobless growth as small business are collapsing and also banks are very stringent to refinance business driven by technology and leading to unemployment? I don't know whether you wish to take that.
I think that is definitely a challenge. I can see a world. Historically, productivity increases have led to output increases and with full employment. But they say that to get there, sometimes you have to, as they say, the world got there, but only after 2 world wars in the 20th century. So there may be disruptions along the way. I think that to some extent, let me put it this way: there's been a puzzle of why Marx was wrong in one important dimension. Everybody said that wages were going to go down. They didn't go down; they went up. But Marx thought that capitalism was going to replace, artisanship and so on, and what we would call today the informal sector, and that everybody was going to become a wage laborer. That did not happen, and the majority of employment in India is not in formal firms where people get a salary and somebody owns the means of production. That transformation didn't happen, and it's a big question of why. Why didn't capitalism replace that other forms of production? And I think one of them is that capitalism, in some sense, requires a dense network of many services. You need electricity, you need water, you need transportation, you need access to banks. You need a very dense network of things, and maybe those networks were very slow to diffuse. India has over 100% cell phone penetration, but it never got to 10% landline penetration in telephones. So maybe these new technologies would allow people to connect more and would allow to a more dramatic transformation of the forms of production. So that would be the optimistic thing. It would empower people to become much more productive because they will be able to connect to each other in a more efficient way. And that may open up a great avenues for growth. There's this village or this valley of a very specific ethnicity in northern Pakistan on the border with China. I forget the name.
Hunza? Is that Hunza? Hunza? No. Okay.
I don't know. I forget.
Yeah. Okay.
But I have one of my former research fellows is from there, and she got the Valley to export accounting services through Upwork. Okay, and so now people don't have to go to Islamabad or to Karachi and so on to do these things. They can remain with their culture. They can remain in their valley. And they are the richest people in the valley by etc. So I think that those opportunities are things that they may not happen automatically, but I think they open up possibilities that we should try to strive for.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we have gone over the time, Charan. Should we conclude the meeting, or because there's another question on LUVWK recovery, which is really going beyond, as Professor said, that I think the issue on his mind.
Definitely a mix of W's and K's. I think it's
that was Keshav Todi.
I would like to see a scenario in which India has 2 epidemiological peaks in 2021, and we think through the economics of that. That what it would look like, and how would you cope, and how would you finance it, and etc.
Right.
For example, just to give you an example, in Panama, they planned everything assuming that by, first of all, many countries thought that in India, when they locked down, that as I think the Prime Minister said, if we don't lock down for 3 weeks, we will lose 30 years or something like that was his line, right? And the idea was, if we lock down now, problem solved, we can go back to normal. We can't go back to normal. So they did that in my part of the world. They did that in March, April. Then they got peaks in the summer, and now they're in the middle of a horrible peak. They told banks delay payments on interest and loans and so on until December. And so they didn't collect any interest until December. Well, right now they cannot start collecting either because they're in lockdown. So how do banks look in that scenario? So that's why my concern is, I sleep much better if I have looked at a really bad scenario and I know what to do in it and I can survive. So my message is just develop a really bad scenario, make sure that you can survive that, and then you'll sleep better.
Well, that's a good warning. I must tell you that many of us here are much more optimistic, but not on the COVID spread. I think we are still maintaining those issues of masking and social distancing. And I hope now about this cleaning air, which I think is very important for India, and so and that's a message coming from politically and every day. Even the economic survey, which I was listening to, his last slide was please maintain social distancing. So, but I take your warning. I think one has to be able to plan for the worst case scenario also. That's always better than being surprised later. Well, with that, thank you very much, and thank all our listeners. We got quite a few. We are right in the middle of a very active period of economic survey, budget, etc. Everybody is focused on that. But I think we've got a pretty good audience for this particular period when people are watching TV for the economic survey and so on. So with that, Charan, do you want to any concluding words?
Yes, Professor, I really want to thank you. This was absolutely excellent and insightful, and at the right time. And the economic survey is just out today. There's going to be wide debate on the economic survey. Dr. Virmani participates actively, and your warnings, I think, are going to get ingrained in his own thought process and how he is going to talk about it. I myself participate actively, and I'm going to talk about it. Your worry about the second peak is my worry too, because the vaccine has yet not rolled out, and just the confidence that the vaccine is out and people have started interacting, we could be heading straight into the second peak. If there are variants coming, then maybe the third peak. So I think you are right. Take the worst case scenario, prepare for the worst, and then you can sleep restfully. You being the planning minister of Venezuela, who knows better than you know, and therefore I take your advice and your warning really seriously, and we will see to it that it reaches the right place. I'm happy to tell you that many people from various ministries do listen to us, and we will be sending this recording of yours to people who matter according to us. So we want to thank you. It will be on our website tomorrow. We are going to put it on Twitter too, so that we can spread the word that you have shared with us extensively, so that we can prepare ourselves for any such eventuality. So thanks to you and thanks to the participants on Friday evening. I would like to just share two more things with you. This is the week which is a very hectic week for economists. On January 31, Sunday, 5:30 to 7, we are discussing the economic survey thought through, read it after reflection on the EGROW Foundation website, 5:30 to 7. The day of the budget is February 1. On February 1, we are doing the same thing from 5:30 to 7. On February 5, we are discussing again the budget with experts from outside of EGROW. So I think one should really look forward to this festival of economic thinking that EGROW is putting out. The shadow monetary policy is on February 2, and I would request you to also, if you have time, to join in for that. So with these announcements, I would now like to once again thank Professor Ricardo for having spared time for us. I'm going to request him that I would like him to present the monkey and the tree theory of transmission of that slow innovative theory. I would like him to discuss that. And at some point, I would like him to also discuss if he's rethought about the original sin, because with this pandemic and the situation deteriorating in the fiscal, the finances of the government, I do not know how the regional sin is going to play out, and we need to probably revisit it. If he could like to present that also. I once again wish him great success in his growth lab. And with that, let me conclude here and thank you once, all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All the best.